This is Climate Change and Social Change. I'm Wilson Dickinson. In this fourth and final presentation, we're going to be considering the practices, places, and forms of power that can bring about change, or the how. So here we are, at the end of a presentation on climate change. It's now the turn of the presenter to offer the action steps. Now I really don't want to follow the script of so many presentations that offer the 1 or 5 things an individual can do. I would say that if we're going to do one thing, it needs to be generative and sustainable. It cannot be going out and buying a more efficient gadget or relying on the structures of consumerism and neoliberalism to undermine their own logic. It cannot be the call to just go vote and a trust that a deeply compromised system will start giving us candidates who seek profound change. If we need an act to start with, it needs to be one that builds capacity and relationships that can support a different kind of life for us and others. So this initial act needs to be something like the magical carbon capture machine that's been in the headlines lately. It turns out that we already have the technology for a machine that is wildly cheap and that has built-in smart technology to develop itself over time to capture more and more carbon. And unbelievably, it requires little to no upkeep. Now, as you've likely already guessed, it's called a tree. So I want to propose that communal level changes can be our trees for social change to address climate change. And so if we want to do one thing, it will need to be a practice, an action that has repetition built into it, which takes time to develop, but which strengthens itself with each observance. We need these practices to be outwardly oriented, so that we are not simply acting alone, but that we are building connections and relationships of joy and love through them. And we need to tie these practices and these relationships to the contours, gifts, and geniuses of our places, so that we are nurtured by creation. So if we are to do one thing, it needs to be planting a seed that suits the soil where we are so that it can grow over time, and like a tree in a forest, so that it can be part of the tangled root system of mutual support that some call the Wood Wide Web. Now the great obstacle here is not individual laziness for starting something new, but that the kind of practices that we need are largely countercultural. They are countercultural like eating healthy food or a vegan diet is countercultural. The messaging from media, the subsidies received by government, the food that is available in the restaurant, at the corner store, at the supermarket, at the friend's house, is almost always set at the default of junk. So we're not just going to need to exercise some discipline to initiate these practices, but we're going to need to create alternative structures and to organize collective power to change these defaults over time. The heart of these practices is to build a beautiful, joyful, and just life. But the hands of these practices is also to build up power, to build up possibility and capacity that can challenge and transform structures of power. So my suggestion for the how then assumes what we have already covered in the other presentations, that the source of our problems are not simply rooted in human nature or technology, but they're rooted in structures of power and ways of life. And if we want to bring about change, the space of agency will likely be in transforming our ways of life, and so that we can build collective power to change structures of power. But such change will take time, and we don't have a lot of time to be bringing about changes. So we need to be acting on 3 timelines. We need to be acting with urgency to push for as much change as we can get over the next 10 years. We also need to be acting over the next several decades to build up communities and networks of people power that will begin to show the viability of alternatives and that build the coalitions that will guide the civilization-wide transition that is coming. So that transition is directed toward compassion, justice, and joy, and not fear, violence, and competition. All the while, we need to be working over the next century for a truly beautiful world in which the vision of the beloved community can be realized. To get there, we will need to build coalitions. These coalitions are rooted in our work with local communities that build lives of integrity and are most firmly woven together in networks that cross lines of difference and comfort, but which are guided by higher common purpose and which expand through the long work of bringing other communities and institutions into the fold. It's through coalitions that we can have the collective power to transform structures of power. These coalitions will also inform and transform our local work in changing our ways of life. But in this presentation on the how, I want to focus on the kind of agency and forms of change that we often do not see because they're hiding in plain sight. This is the power that comes at the level of everyday life and local community. How we get here is through cultivating and building power, but not power as we typically think of it. The power that will empower our efforts is not of the spectacular order of pyrotechnics, but is of the subtle power that is hiding in plain sight. So our task is to both unveil the mechanisms and relationships of power that already surround us, and to begin to create alternative forms. So by power here, I mean something very different from the direct violence and coercion that we might associate with power. Rather, I'm thinking more in the sense in which the philosopher Michel Foucault used it. Power is the field of possibilities. Violence forces, breaks, destroys, and closes off possibilities. Power does not so much act on things directly, but it determines or frames the possibilities in which action takes place. So on this understanding, power incites, it induces, it seduces. It makes easier or more difficult. So power is not simply exercised by a strong man on a passive people, but power is exercised through the ways subjectivities and capacities are shaped. So for example, in the case of education, power is not simply exercised in dictating what a person thinks, but it's exercised in forming how they act, relate, and think. So educational institutions enact certain modes of power, not just through the content of what they teach, but also in the form of how they teach. As children, we are shaped by the practices that mark our lives in school. Through practices of questioning, testing, and grading, children create certain kinds of relationships. These processes of evaluation shape relationships with authorities, relationships with ourselves and our own self-understanding, and relationships with peers who are differentiated from us or in competition with us. So the practices of mainstream education build certain habits and capacities as we learn to follow a clock, respond to a bell, sit at a desk, do small, controlled tasks. Now, highlighting these functions does not mean that all education is oppressive or bad, but is instead to highlight the mechanisms of power that are often hiding in plain sight. Whereas the problems we face often take violent form, like the direct confrontation of hate speech, power can work in subtle ways where labels are not thrown at people, but they are presented in a seemingly neutral manner on a form. So in the space of supposed objectivity and reasonableness, power simply gives us a series of labels with boxes to check and asks us to assign the label to ourselves. So bringing these structures of power into focus opens the possibility that our relationships, processes, and structures could be organized otherwise. Seeing the power relations that follow from getting small children to sit at desks all day can allow us to imagine other kinds of spaces and workflows, like the Montessori classroom with workstations. And we can draw analogies from these areas to transformations in religious communities, like the shift from asking children to sit in worship or wander in a nursery to organizing children's worship and wonder. Now, this shift in thinking about power means that we need to be very intentional about the spaces, the stories, and the practices that shape relationships and capacities. This discernment and intentionality does not mean that we can control the results, but it does open the space for a different set of possibilities. So that we can begin to see the power that is hiding in plain sight, I want to propose a little heuristic structure that it will allow us to see the way that possibilities, relationships, and ways of life are framed as in a picture. So when we look at the spaces of our daily life, we might show these dynamics by highlighting the narrative, stories, and memories that often organize and direct them. These aspects might be thought of as the focal point in a picture. These stories serve to draw our attention to a certain place and to shape our expectations for what is possible. So the movement and activity that animates this slice of life picture can be thought of as our practices and habits. Perhaps least visible but still fundamental is the background or landscape created by spaces and architectures. So to see power hiding in plain sight, we might look at the focal point or the moral narrative, the movement or the practices, and the ground or the structures and spaces. So to give this skeletal account some flesh, let's look at a rather unremarkable picture of daily life. This is a picture of a housing development. Now the focal point of the picture are uniform houses. And these houses are bearers of a great deal of meaning. It's at the heart of the narrative we call the American dream. You don't have to be an HGTV addict to have a sense that in our culture, buying your own home promises a sense of security and accomplishment. It holds the promise of a certain kind of lifestyle, and with the realities of debt requires a certain kind of work life. So the focal point on this account is the concrete and symbolic piece of private property, the home. This serves as an orienting and central part of this way of life. There is little movement in this picture, but I think it's helpful as the eye is trained on the road. The activities here are either kept private in the house or drawn out on the road for work, entertainment, and consumption. Now the landscape, perhaps least visible, shows that this way of life and these activities are built on loss. The soil in this place has been stripped to make these homes. It will likely require the extraction of fertility from another place to restore a kind of faux green lawn in this space. The losses and costs of creating these spaces will be covered up by this extraction from others. So because this scene of a housing development is so normal in our context, it is likely hard to see the ways that power flows through it. Ideals and stories about how life should be shape the possibility of our days and our relationships. We might not see the ways that the habits and practices easily flow along these predetermined paths, and how all of this is built upon a decimated landscape that must draw upon the fertility of other hidden places to cover over these scars. We have to begin to see how these stories, practices, and places shape possibility before we can begin to imagine them otherwise. But we also need positive pictures. We need active imagination so that we can begin to see how else life might be in these spaces. So the work of sustainability and justice will not usually begin with a fresh slate in a pristine place. We will not address climate change by leveling our existing cities, towns, and suburbs, and by building brand new, ideally designed places. Rather, for a long time, this is largely what we are stuck with, and we need to begin to find ways to repurpose these spaces and places. So part of what we need to do is to find new focal points, new ideals and ideas, or possibly restored and radicalized old narratives and memories that will draw our attention and care to other spaces. Spaces like a community garden. The community garden turns its attention away from the single-family home and creates a space where the place, the structures, and the space can be restored. Here, the animating practices are about collaboration, connection, and care. The garden has power insofar as it opens a different set of possibilities. It offers practices that can reshape our hearts and relationships. It offers a different vision of a shared, good life that can transform our imaginations, and it offers a space where we can begin to heal our places. And to be clear, I keep appealing to community gardens because they are a form that I have experience with. So this is an illustrative example, not a recipe or a solution. So we need to learn to see power and to actively imagine alternatives in our respective contexts. The kind of work that I am arguing for that will shape collective power won't operate through structures of power that flow from the top down or demand the strict application of blueprints. The kind of power we are looking to build comes from collaborating with places and local knowledge. So Herbert Reed and Betsy Taylor, in their book Recovering the Commons, provide a nice pair of examples that follow the path of blueprints and another that works with local knowledge. So around the mid-20th century, Western nations and economies forced the methods of industrial agriculture on countries from around the world. The supposition was that the farming practices of a local place and the knowledge of the past needed to be replaced with new technologies. The result has meant short-term gains in a few commodity goods, but the complete devastation of rural communities, a tremendous loss in soil fertility, and enormous emissions that contribute to climate change. Now, Reed and Taylor contrast this story with another one. In a rural region of India, an extension agent proposed to a group of indigenous people that they should start raising fish to eat in ponds. Now, rather than take the extension agent's blueprint for fish ponds, which would have taken a great deal of work and would have competed for space with existing rice paddies, local people began to slowly experiment with raising fish in the rice paddies. It took a great deal of trial and error to figure out what kind of fish could be introduced at what point in the rice's growth for the whole system to work. But eventually they found a way. And Reed and Taylor wonder what our world would look like now if instead of taking a blueprint around the world that was driven by a narrative of progress and that did not respect local genius, what if instead we had been working innovatively and collaboratively with what already exists? So Christian communities and churches can be one site where social experimentation can happen in collaboration with the wisdom of tradition and the genius of a local place. Though Christian communities are often nervous to embrace their role in flows of power, this account of power I've been following means that power is unavoidable. The life of faith and ministry is always tied up with all kinds of power. There's a reason that the word ministry and administration are so close. Ministers and administrators are both concerned with the conduct and care of everyday life and relationships. But that does not mean that all ministers and administrators are forced to deploy the same kind of power relations. Rather, there are different kinds of structures, narratives, and processes that nurture different kinds of relationships and capacities. We can see this in our own lives if we start the day with prayer or if we start with checking our email and our to-do list. Now, we're often shy to talk about power because we don't see how it is normally and constantly operating. Now, the way that neoliberalism administers our daily life is often invisible because it is so ubiquitous and ever-present. It is the proverbial water we swim around as early 20th century fish. Now, the earlier drawn heuristic can help bring out some of these forms of power that organize our daily lives. Among the orienting narratives of our current dominant culture are the American dream and what I would like to call the American gospel of work. The American gospel of work trains our eyes to always be looking at our surroundings in terms of market measures, where our orienting values are about productivity and efficiency. Our feelings of worth are based on business and production. Our identity is oriented around our work and the status symbols that it can convey, and so on. We look at all aspects of our lives in these terms as we spend our time and invest our energy and invest in our children and on and on. Now, these guiding narratives are integrated in with the spaces of neoliberalism, where everything is privatized. This is the geography of the single-family suburban home, of strip malls, of stadiums. These forms of power shape relationships and possibilities. For example, this form of privatization has greatly eroded the spaces of what is called social infrastructure, where people are able to gather in places that are not guarded by a paywall, places like parks, public pools, community centers, sidewalks, porches, schools, etc., etc. On the other side of this increasingly private single-family and single-serving home is the loss of communal relationships outside of the nuclear family, commercial exchange, and work. Power flows through this way of life by means of all kinds of practices related to shopping and work and assessment, through the collective practices of spectator sports and screen-oriented entertainment. These practices create a field of possibilities that shape our relationships with other people and ourselves and our places. Shopping in the supermarket or online is a practice that places workers in the role of employees rather than partners, and renders the blessings of the earth a commodity with a price. Likewise, technologies of assessment shape our hearts as we interpret our lives, our worth, and our action through the categories of production, efficiency, and profit. So the church and Christian communities and Christian traditions can intervene on all of these fronts, as they can unveil the destructive tendencies of neoliberal life, and they can offer alternatives. Whereas the focal narrative of the gospel of work places our trust in the benevolent forces of the market, which rewards people with wealth and success based on their works, the gospel of Jesus Christ unveils the destructive forces of mammon and wealth, and instead lifts up the unmerited grace of God, which is good news for the poor and which will lift the burdens placed on the oppressed. Christian communities can give people the stories, ideals, images, spaces, and practices where they can come to see their lives and identities are not defined by their work, but they can be defined as a creature, as a neighbor, as a child of God, and their efforts can be directed toward justice and love, not efficiency and productivity, toward people, not profits. Now again, these communities can serve not just to offer another vision or story, but to give practices and places that incarnate another way of life. Practices of prayer and study can counter forms of assessment that shape our daily conduct. Practices of caregiving, of shared meals, of holy celebration can displace practices of shopping, eating on the go, and empty entertainment. These practices hold power that make a different set of relationships possible. Likewise, Christian tradition and communities can help us transform how we use our space. This includes how we organize our households, how we cultivate and care for the land, how we connect our communities, and how we use already existing church buildings. Furthermore, the concrete communities of churches in the United States could be some of the bearers of memory and place in a context of profound mobility, where people move from place to place. Congregations could serve as an anchor that give people an intergenerational account and intergenerational relationships in a community. Furthermore, prophetic and creational perspectives from Christian traditions could serve to help people see their places in longer time scales, as they might think of the geological identity of their place, and think of the colonial and extractive histories that have traumatized their places. The church could be a space that holds these memories and that provides this vantage point so that we could become more rooted in the places we live. Christian communities can incarnate a different way of life. They can do this by laying bare and unveiling the cruelty of the narratives, the practices, and the spaces and structures that currently organize our relationships and action. They can also serve as spaces where we experiment with how the wisdom of tradition, the insight of social movements, and the local genius of our places can be woven together to build up a beautiful life and collective power. This collective power can be joined with others to begin to transform the wider structures of power that make simple, joyful, and just living possible. So as we look for our initial steps for addressing climate change, we need to be looking toward wider social change. Now, I would offer a further suggestion with these steps that we would do well to start with the margins. And his organizing, Christ constantly turned to those on the margins. He called upon people who were on the outside or placed on the bottom of the hierarchies of empire, and he saw in them goodness, blessings, and power. In these communities, Christ found people who were awake to the evils of empire and who were already living in the adaptive wisdom of trying to find a way beyond those ways laid out by the dominant structures of power. Likewise, people of privilege would do well to learn from those who are on the margins and who are already leading. Through standing in solidarity and learning from other communities, we can gain an alternative vantage point. We can see the ways that our lives are complicit in the destruction of through dominant systems, and we can come to see the ways that our lives too are deformed and desecrated by the operations of extractive economies and empty moral traditions. I would also suggest that we start on the margins in a different sense. Here I mean the margins in the economic sense of what is left over or excess. So for people of some means, power, and privilege, the current crisis demands bold action. But in our context, we might not have the structures in place where we can fully give ourselves over to it. So we need to take that which exceeds what we need and act boldly with it. And by this, I do not mean that we volunteer on the weekends or that we pencil something in on the side. That's a false sense of need and want that allows dominant structures of power to dictate the logic of our lives. I mean that we struggle to make an honest accounting of what it is we truly need, and we begin to deeply change our ways of life with the abundance that we have. Now, I want to offer an example from my own life with a good deal of fear and trembling. I don't use this example because it's the best one or pretend that I have found some kind of a secret. It's simply the example of the beginning of a social experiment that I know best. So a few years ago, my wife and I sold our house and created a multi-family household with my sister, my nephew, and my mom. So this move that combined households did in measurable ways reduce our carbon footprint through heating and cooling, but it was also something that made all kinds of other things possible. We changed some of the material parameters of our place, and it led to changes in our practices. It lessened our financial burdens and allowed us to spend less time engaged in wage-earning labor and to give more time to working on writing, activism, and building community through efforts like a community garden and a dinner church. It transformed relationships and allowed us to share with others in efforts of childcare and other chains of care. It also provided space for us to begin to push against the powerful narratives of the American gospel of work. This was a generative and sustaining act that made other things possible. Now, I acknowledge and want to underline that this example is not a blueprint, and it's likely not transferable in its particulars. It comes out of our circumstances and the privilege and blessings in our lives. But it seems like the least that we can do in the face of ecological catastrophe and profound global injustice is to use our privilege and excess to try and bring about small changes that can have cascading effects. And while these changes might not seem to be momentous, we need to make the kind of changes that hold the possibility of wide-scale, or at least growing, transformation, rather than changes that hold the possibility of the efficient operation of the status quo. And so the first step is to engage in a bold discernment of what we really need and to make real and substantive changes in our ways of life. Now, my reason for starting with the margin is to acknowledge that our problems are systemic and they will not be solved by individuals. Structures of power still exercise a great deal of influence in our lives, and we cannot just choose them away. Furthermore, we do not have the blueprint yet that will work in every context. We will need to learn from the processes of change, and the deeper we get into alternative ways of life, the wiser we will become, and the more that will seem possible. Our ideas right now are likely too limited and still too defined in terms of empire. And so we want a place to begin where we can learn from our place and our people and appreciate their genius and adapt to changing circumstances. And from these spaces to build networks with other initiatives and communities and to transform existing institutions and build generative, sustainable, collective power. So this is the advice at the end of the climate talk. Plant the tree of communal practice and power in your shared life, and from here, build collective power that can bring about social change.